In this video, we are going to learn how to make a bias-bound seam finish using bias tape. In this instance, we are using commercial bias tape, though you could pre-make your bias tape. The uses I have for this type of seam finish is probably most used when I am flatlining materials together so that I have multiple layers of fabric that are caught into a seam. A bodice or a corset would be a good example of this. It's a very clean finish. It can go over multiple layers, being sure that you've caught all the layers in the seam finish and not having to worry about one or two of the layers slipping out, causing it to fray. So that is the use of the bias bound seam finish. Let's see how we make it. So again, we have to start with a plain seam, pretty straightforward. Use 2 pieces of muslin or any cotton, and then you can stitch it on your stitch line. Here I've used a 5/8 inch seam allowance, pretty basic. It could be a longer, wider seam finish, depending on what you're doing. Then we are going to press it open, and now it's ready for the bias tape. I now need to prep my bias tape. So with my bias tape, I have my single fold bias tape here, and it is single fold that it has a fold this way and this way. So that is what we consider a single fold bias tape. To make this a double fold, which is what I need is a double fold, I am going to fold this over in half, making it half of the width. And that is what we call a double fold, is that it's been folded over a second time. And then I just press that nice and flat over, and then it will be prepped so that I can put it on the edge of the seam allowance. So there is my prepped bias tape ready to go. And you can see on the inside, my seam allowances are completely caught inside. So the next step would be to take this seam allowance or bias tape that we have and encase our seam allowance. So we have our raw edge of our material. This is our bias tape, and I'm literally just going to fold this over that edge. So then I'm going to pin it. The thing that's probably the hardest part of this is that the bias tape does have a tendency to want to slip off. So you have to make sure that as you're pinning it, that you're really pinning it all the way in so that it's laying flat up into there. Now, sometimes to help myself pin so that I can make sure that I'm not pinning to my fabric underneath, I might slide a ruler under there or some other solid material so that I don't accidentally pin into my fabric underneath. So sliding that on, making sure that that's all the way in, I'm going to pin this there and go all the way down. Remember to visualize the direction that you will be putting this into the sewing machine. So I would be sewing it this direction. My pins are pointed towards where the needle would be so that I can pull my pins out easily as I am sewing along. So there's my one side. And then I would flip this over. We can trim this edge. We don't need all of that. And then we would do it to the other side. It is buckling a little bit just because of the nature of how the pins are causing it to buckle. That will go away once you stitch it on. So, and then I also like to have my bias tape, you can see, sort of go a little bit over the edge just in case I need a little bit extra to cover everything. So then I'm going to pin this on, making sure that I haven't let any of this slip out. You can put in more pins than I am. I don't need as many. I do think that it's smart to go ahead and pin this instead of just taking this to the machine and trying to stitch it on the first time. That can cause it to really pull away, which will be just added frustration on your part. And there's my last one. So then from here, I'm going to do 2 things. One, I'm going to make sure that I've pinned solidly on this side, because I also need to make sure that when I stitch this on, it's not slipping off and causing it to be not on the garment. So there it is, pinned on both sides. I'm going to then take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to stitch it. There are two ways in which you can stitch this, and I have done one of each on this particular sample. So you can do a straight stitch and try to keep it as straight as possible, making sure you're catching the back side. And that is completely a beautiful stitched bias bound seam finish. But it can be a little tricky because sometimes the seam allowance will want to fight you a little bit and not let you have that beautiful straight line. It's also harder to make sure that you're catching this on this side. So the other method to do, and this is probably the method I use the most, is I will just zigzag it. I'll set my machine so it's like a 2 or 3 length with a 3 width, so on the zigzag. And I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and I'm just going to zigzag the whole piece. And you can see that it's zigzagged on both sides. That way, no matter what happens, even if on the back side it falls off a little bit into the seam allowance, I know when it zigzags back over this way, it's actually going to catch all the way across, and there's no chance of my seam allowance not catching and falling off. So this is a more secure method and very popular to use for this kind of seam finish. So either one is more acceptable. This one looks a little cleaner, but is definitely more challenging to keep it looking nice, where this one is a very practical and strong way to secure the bias tape to your seam finish. So there is our bias bound seam finish.